Good evening, everybody. Welcome to part 2 of our Woodland Creation and Management series. Part 1 discussed the benefits of woodlands, and part 2 starts to go into how you actually establish it. So from the fencing and ground preparation through to choice of species and thinking about grants and how you get started. For those of you that were unable to make the last webinar, this is now available on the FAS Scotland website. So if you just search Farm Advisory Service Scotland, Woodland Creation and Management Part 1, you'll be able to view a recording of last week's webinar. We currently have 35 of you on the line so far, and we had 80 odd registered. So there'll probably be a few more joining in over the last few minutes. And I'll just take this moment just to introduce you to how it's going to work this evening. So this is scheduled to run 6 till 7:30. We are joined by 4 speakers. So we've got George Hepburne Scott, who is working for Forest Carbon, and we'll discuss carbon funding for woodland creation projects. Next, we'll be joined by Jonathan Cameron of Cheviot Trees, who will discuss tree nursery perspectives. Then we'll be joined by Robertson of Robertson Fencing, talking about forestry ground preparation and fencing. And then finally, we have Julie Paton from Scottish Forestry, talking woodland establishment, getting it right. So we've got a pretty full-on list of speakers for the evening. We will provide each speaker has got a 15-minute slot. So after each speaker, there will be an opportunity for a question and answer. I would just like to pass you over to our first speaker of the evening, George Hepburne Scott. He's a qualified chartered surveyor and is the Business Development Director at Forest Carbon. Forest Carbon was established in 2006 specifically to support the creation of new woodlands in the UK on behalf of businesses in recognition of their carbon footprints. With to date creation of 172 new UK woodlands covering 12,500 acres and partners ranging from FTSE listed businesses to small enterprises. And they also have developed the UK's first ever carbon peatland restoration project validated under the Peatland Code. So without further ado, I would like to pass you over to George Hepburne Scott to hear more about Forest Carbon. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Firstly, I'd like just to start with a brief overview of Forest Carbon. So moving on to the first slide, please, Stephen. Forest Carbon, the leading developer of woodland creation projects for the UK voluntary carbon market. We've helped to co-fund over 175 new woodland creation projects across the UK, and these are ranged in size from 5 hectares up to 350 hectares in size. The funding comes from selling carbon credits to UK businesses wishing to mitigate the impact of their carbon footprints. Carbon sequestration is only one of a wide range of benefits that the woodland creation projects are delivering. All our projects undergo rigorous quality assurance process under the UK government's Woodland Carbon Code. And as covered in the introduction, we've also been active in developing the peatland carbon market in the UK, and we also developed Ireland's first carbon projects working on behalf of Microsoft. These are some headline statistics about some of the kind of key achievements that we have really, I suppose, hit over the 14 years of trading. I think probably the stat that I take most pride in is the fact that we have helped co-fund 7% of all new woodlands created in the UK since 2013, which we believe is quite an impressive statistic. We've got a long-standing relationship working with SAC and have helped co-fund 15 projects to date that SAC have been advising on. We've got another 3 in the pipeline. And these are 2 projects that we've helped fund up in the north of Scotland, one back in 2015, another in 2017. All our projects, as I mentioned, that are funded by our partners are validated and verified under the Woodland Carbon Code. This was developed by the UK government back in 2011, and it offers an independent auditing process and ISO certified carbon credits. And these credits are accepted under all UK government guidance on environmental reporting. And really the focus is on projects meeting all international carbon project rules. And this covers aspects such as additionality, that the intervention of carbon funding was critical to a project proceeding, quality assurance, conservatism, permanence, and monitoring. And just on that final point, there's a verification process that projects are required to adhere to, and this further enforces standards. It's now recognised as one of the world's domestic carbon standards that leads the way. And all woodland carbon units are listed on Market, which is the home to the gold standard, the VCS, and other voluntary. The market is currently voluntary in the UK. No businesses are compelled to take action to invest in woodland carbon credits or peatland carbon credits. There is no market as we would understand it, like the stock market or the compliance carbon market, with no kind of high volume of supply and demand of credits changing hands constantly in a floating price. And there's no relationship to the compliance carbon market prices. Transactions are all driven face-to-face through the selling efforts of developers such as ourselves. And prices are driven by A, what it will cost to get a project off the ground, and B, what a company will voluntarily pay for it. And we need a willing buyer and a willing seller to create the transaction. Currently, we are able to raise for landowners between £750 up to £2,250 per net planted hectare, and this is typically paid out in two tranches at year 1 and at year 5, and this is on top of any available public grants. This is based on the future carbon that a project is anticipated to sequester, less some significant buffers to reflect scientific risk and project failure risk. Pricing is dependent on species mix, yield class, soil type, ground prep techniques, and long-term management plans, because ultimately this will influence the level of carbon that a particular project will sequester. I'll go into a bit more detail on that in the next slide. And this funding range typically represents between 15 to 30% of all costs of establishment and management over the first 10 years of the project. And this can cover the cost of the trees, the ground prep, fencing, and labour costs. The carbon funding can generate a surplus for the landowner. It depends on the cost of the project and the volume of carbon that a project is estimated to sequester. This slide illustrates the estimated carbon sequestered by different project types and different management regimes. The bottom two lines in red and blue reflect commercial conifer projects, one being clear-felled and one being thinned and clear-felled, and it is evident from year 30 onwards that the carbon being sequestered tails off and is largely kind of capped at between 200 to 250 tonnes of CO2 per net hectare. And at the top line, the purple line, is representative of a non-intervention broadleaf project, and this shows that by year 100, that profile of project will typically have sequestered probably double that clear-fell conifer schemes, which are shown by the red and blue lines. I've shown here just the brief outline of the process that projects are required to go through in order to get to a stage of a payment that's being made to a landowner or a land manager. The first step is completing our application form, which can either be done by the project host or by their forest manager, and we require that this is submitted to us well in advance of planting commencing. We will then review the project, and this will involve calculating the carbon estimated to be sequestered and also scrutinising the additionality assessment. And we will then, if we are happy at that stage, then make an offer for the carbon from that project. And then if that offer is acceptable to the project host, we will then issue a contract for signing. The scheme will then go forwards for planting. We will then, following completion of planting, get the project validated by an independent certification body. Currently that's OF&G and the Soil Association, who are the two recognised certification bodies. And once that project is validated, we will then make the first 70% payment to the host. And this is typically within 6 months of planting being completed. The final payment comes at year 5, once the project has had its first verification inspection, and on the basis that that is successful, we will then make that payment. I've listed here some of those key commitments that we require of project hosts and that the Woodland Carbon Code also requires of project hosts. Contracts must be for a minimum of 30 years, but can run up to 100 years, but are typically within the range of 35 to 70 years. Projects must demonstrate that carbon funding was critical in enabling a project to proceed. That's the aspect of additionality that I covered off earlier. And another point is that if projects suffer loss or damage, there must be restocking of those trees that were lost. And we must also be notified if the woodland is to change hands and be sold or a tenancy changes. I've touched on here just a couple of case studies of projects that we've worked recently with SAC on. This is one that was planted mid-2019 near Peebles. This project was made up of lots of small strips. It'll be one that Stephen Adlard will be familiar with, which he worked on. But it was made up of lots of thin strips, and as a consequence, there were very high fencing costs that the owner here was facing. And this is where carbon funding played a critical role in helping to co-fund the project and helping cover some of the shortfall between the cost of establishment and the grant funding available. This is a project that we helped co-fund back in 2012, and this is working with SAC's forestry team up in Turriff. A major consideration for the tenants who we worked with on this project was the loss of farm income from converting 17.5 hectares of grazing ground to woodland. And again, carbon funding was critical in persuading the tenants here to progress with the project. The bottom photograph there shows Andy Wells from the Crown Estate, who were the landlords in this case, and their agent alongside the tenant, Tilly Smith. And the funding, the carbon funding provided here on this project was from ICAP, who are a London-based financial trading company who we've worked with over a number of years. I was keen just to touch on this project. This has been running now for 8 years, where Forest Carbon's worked closely with Tweed Forum, an environmental charitable trust based in the Scottish Borders. Tweed Forum has identified woodland creation opportunities that would help slow runoff and increase flood storage, as well as improving the physical condition of local watercourses. And crucially, funding that Forest Carbon was able to raise from a range of partners that I've listed on this slide. This funding helps cover the cost of the woodland creation projects alongside any available grants, and in certain cases provided an additional income stream over and above costs. And this wider project, which included the re-meandering of the Eddleston Water, which is a tributary of the River Tweed, will continue to be monitored by Dundee University, SEPA and Scottish Borders Council. I appreciate that the seminar today is focused around woodland creation, but I was keen just to touch briefly on our engagement with the peatland restoration sector. This is a project that we helped co-fund back at the end of 2017, a 77-hectare peatland restoration project, which combined a mix of actually eroding and drained blanket bog. It required the reprofiling of hags and gullies and the damming of 3.7 kilometres of drains. And this was the first project to be validated under the peatland code and the first to be co-funded with carbon funding. And we are hopeful in the near future of doing some further projects of a similar profile to this. And just finally, I just wanted to give a brief snapshot of some of those funding partners that we have worked with over the last 14 years. There are many more that could have been fitted onto this slide, but just to add that we are seeing a growing interest from businesses to invest in both woodland creation projects and peatland restoration projects across the UK, and keen to work with those on the ground, helping establish woodlands, to see whether we can further put more dots on the map and help create new woodlands. So just to finish up with the final slide, Stephen, some of my contact details, but I know this will be shared with you further on beyond this webinar. Many thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, George. And it's great to hear that you've got a growing interest of people wanting to be, of businesses keen to be involved. That's always very encouraging. And I was just wondering personally, if anyone has any questions, please type them in. And just to get the ball rolling, I was just wondering if it's a challenge keeping up to date with the science in terms of sequestration.
Yeah, it's a good question. The Woodland Carbon Code relies upon the metrics on which it's based are fed in from forest research, and they ultimately produce the kind of lookup tables that provide the estimations of carbon sequestered by different species on different soil types under different kind of management regimes. So we are reliant upon that, as is anyone else who's putting projects through this process. But we are constantly looking to keep abreast of any developments around the science around woodland creation on different soil types. There's clearly growing understanding and work being done to try and further understand that. So it is a challenge because it's a fast-moving area, but it's one that's crucial for us to keep abreast of.
I can imagine. We have one question through our audience. So if a landowner is a non-VAT registered, would the income over 5 years make the woodland eligible to reclaim VAT on the project?
That's a good question. I think our recommendation with any tax aspects is that any owners or tenants consult their accountants for advice around the treatment of carbon income with regards to projects. And we have a good contact at Confor. They have a tax advisor there, so I'm delighted to try and help that particular party who's raised that question and make that introduction if necessary. So look, I mean, I think that's the message. I think any tax advice needs to come from an accountant ultimately on those aspects.
Perfect. Okay. And last question: can this carbon calculation be made to offset the carbon footprint of the farm?
Yes, it can do, and we are increasingly aware of a number of landowners and land managers who are looking to utilise the Woodland Carbon Code to generate credits that they aren't necessarily looking to transact and gain a monetary sum for, but looking to use to report against their own footprint. It might be the case that some might utilise some of the carbon from a woodland creation project for that purpose and might look to sell the remainder. But it very much depends on the nature of your land holding and how you want to, I suppose, utilise that commodity which the carbon ultimately represents.
Okay. And I did say that was a final question, but another one's come through which looks quite good. How do your standards relate to IPCC and UN standards?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the work done by the Woodland Carbon Code and the advisory board and the advisors to that, they work very closely to ensure that the standard is kind of maintained to international standards, which I think I've touched on in one of my earlier slides. So I think that is core to the Woodland Carbon Code and its recognition as one of the leading standards within the UK. So close consideration will be given to standards globally. So I think it's an important question to raise.
Perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, George. You can have a breather now, and we'll move on to our next speaker. Thank you. So our next speaker of the evening is Jonathan Cameron. So Jonathan Cameron is the sales manager for Cheviot Trees. Cheviot Trees are a family-owned, cell-grown tree nursery located in the Scottish borders, and they produce approximately 7 million trees per year for the forestry and landscaping sectors. So thank you, Jonathan. I'll pass over to you.
Okay, thanks, Poppy. I presume we're okay stream-wise, Poppy? We can see the right screen.
Perfect.
Yeah,
excellent. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you very much. Normally at this time of year, we'd have quite a few clients visiting us to look at crops for the following planting season, but this is clearly not a normal time. So showing you around digitally is a little bit new for us, but we'll do our best to give you a virtual tour over the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. So here's an image of our nursery. It was taken about probably about a year ago now, and since then the site's expanded quite a bit. So we've added in some extra polytunnel space, and we've also acquired an ex-arable field, so that'll give us a little bit more outside growing space as well. Okay, so we are located about 5 miles west of Berwick-upon-Tweed, Scottish borders. As Poppy says, we're family owned. We've been owned by the same family that started Cheviot Trees 30 odd years ago. So the owners have a very strong agricultural background. We were founded by farmers, and they still farm in addition to the tree nursery business. The company was originally started as a producer of vegetable plants in modules or plugs, and they would then supply them to farms for field planting. But the problem with this is that it only utilised our growing space for a very short period of time. So they started growing trees in cells as a diversification project, and over the years the veg plants have been phased out in favour of the trees. So we were probably one of the first growers of cell grown trees in the UK, but they grew in popularity very quickly. The benefits were sort of clear and obvious. So on the left of your screen you can see an image of cell grown Douglas fir. So the plants are grown in plastic growing trays, and then they're removed from the trays prior to dispatch. So we do about 7 million trees per year from a range of, it's about sort of 80 to 100 different species. So 80 to 100 species is a lot. Your normal forestry nursery might produce somewhere in the region of maybe sort of 20, 30 max. But our large range has been very, very helpful over the years. We service lots of different markets, ranging from forestry, landscaping, leisure and recreation, so places like golf courses, etc. So if one sector's been quiet, the others picked up the slack. So being diverse and having a really wide range really helps to spread the risk. So we consider ourselves to be a full service and full supply partner. So we deliver everything that our client will need for their project, including items such as tree shelters, stakes, fertilizer, etc. So the majority of our customers are in the UK, but we have an active customer base in 14 different countries throughout Europe, and we occasionally send trees to the Falkland Islands as well. So that probably proves the point that our plants are tough and robust if they can withstand a climate where the summer's cold and the winter's probably twice as cold. Okay, so within the marketplace, there are two main formats of plant. You have cell grown on the left, which is obviously what we produce. So to produce this plant, the seed is sown into a growing tray, and the plant will continue to grow in this tray right up until the point of dispatch. So plants are sold at an age of between sort of 1 to 2 years. Next up, we have bare rooted on the right, which is not what we do, but these plants are grown in a field, and the seed is sown directly into the soil, and they're then lifted up when they're dormant during the winter months. So plants are sold at an age of anywhere between 1 to 4 years, depending on the species and type. So here's a bit of a comparison between cell grown and bare root. So first of all, bare rooted plants, you're looking at a price range of sort of between 20 to 40 pence. Benefits are they are lightweight, very easy to store on site. You can get a lot of plants in a bag, so they're easy to transport around site. Have a relatively low initial cost outlay. Some of the cons can be that the roots may be damaged during the lifting process, and sometimes they can be prone to stress damage as well, especially in the springtime. They also have a shorter planting period, whereas cell grown plants can be supplied nearly all year round. Cells in the region of about 30 to 50 pence. When we deliver them, they are a sort of full intact root system, and it's consistent in size as well. They are more expensive than bare roots, but generally the savings are made further down the line, as they really need to be beaten up post planting. Okay, we'll just have a quick look at our production process. So the first stage is finding what we refer to as forestry productive material. So this is seeds, cuttings, etc. So we produce the vast majority of our plants from seed. Seed collection isn't something that we actually do in-house. It's a very tricky business. We're very good at growing trees, and our seed specialists are very good at picking and processing seed. Some species can be picked and sown straight away, straight into the plugs, but most need to be cleaned and processed before they can be sown. Some species can be put straight in the tray, or they'll require a treatment process, such as stratification, to try and simulate the natural conditions that the seeds would have in the wild before germination can occur. That's some juniper that you can see in the photo here. Okay, so once the seed's processed and received onto our nursery, we fill our growing trays with a compost mixture and insert the seeds. So in this photo, that's probably walnut that's been sown. So that photo would have been taken probably around about January time. These will grow up to a finished plant height of about 40 centimeters by October of the same year. So we have lots of different cell trays that are for different species, and the trays are very clever. So they have vertical ridges on the inside of them. So as soon as the root hits the side of the tray, the ridge encourages that root downwards, and it stops the roots from spiraling around in the tray. The trays are extremely long-lasting and heavy-duty, so they're designed to be reused. Most of our growing trays will be at least 25 years old. We just wash them in between, so there's wash them in between each production cycle, so there's zero plastic waste. The growing trays then move to a polytunnel in most cases, where the seeds will germinate. The polytunnel environment is unheated, but we have absolute control over all aspects of the plant when they're inside. So we can open the roof automatically to adjust temperature, and all of our irrigation is carefully calibrated and computer controlled. So it's operated by using a tablet computer. So my colleague can use it anywhere on site and adjust things at a moment's notice. Okay, so once the plants will then move outside from the polytunnel, and they'll be outside for the majority of the time, and they'll stay there until they're ready for dispatch. So at the time of dispatch, we take the plants out of their trays. We refer to this process as grading. So we're grading the trees based on quite a few different factors, ranging from height, what else, collar diameter, so the stem thickness, bud formation, and a few other factors. So we then carefully wrap them into bundles. The bundles are labelled and then packed into boxes ready for dispatch. Photograph's quite a good illustration of the root system here. So you can see on these lines where the ridges have worked and the roots have been encouraged nicely downwards. Okay, let's just move on to the next one. Right, okay, so delivery. So we deliver direct to site, either standing upright in cages or lying flat in boxes. In most cases, the lorry will also have the shelters, stakes, and all of the bits and pieces that the client will need as well. So most of our lorries are equipped with onboard forklifts, so we can easily and safely unload on site. But the next section, in my opinion, is probably one of the most important and is often overlooked or not explored enough in detail, and it relates to the seed source that your trees are grown from. So in our opinion, you'll see much greater gains by ensuring that your trees, plant stock, are from the most appropriate seed source. When I say gain, I'm not just referring to financial gain, but also survivability. So we place a lot of emphasis on growing quite a wide selection of different seed sources to try and meet all of our different client objectives. So there's a lot of research and science behind selecting the right seed source, but I'll just try and give you a very quick and simple overview. So let's start with an example for a native or a conservation type scheme. So we know that typically native trees and shrubs will support a wider range of plants and animals than non-native or introduced species. So the native species maintain local character. They'll often do better in harsh or hostile local conditions, and probably more likely to survive and flourish than introduced species. So the UK is split into 24 different native seed zones. So this should be, there's a map on the right of your screen here, which you can see. So we're in region 204 on the east coast here, and these are all defined areas which have similar ecological and climatic characteristics. So we produce stock for most of these different seed zones. The genetic makeup of local provenance generally ensures that the trees that we're going to supply are better adapted to the local conditions. So local conditions as in soil conditions, temperature, fluctuations up and down, perhaps areas of higher rainfall, exposure, high wind speeds, etc. We should also look at, equally as important to look at productive and commercial forestry, given that there's significant demand for timber, and there will be for a very long time. So where high quality timber production is the primary objective, we would look more at the genetic quality of the parent material when making a decision on which seed source to use. So we've just looked at local zones for native and conservation type projects, but for the productive and commercial forestry, we need to look more at categories. Okay, so here are the categories. So these categories are used throughout Europe. So we buy our seed based on where it's been collected from, i.e. the zones, but also the category that's in. So starting at the top, we've got a source identified up here in yellow. This is seed that's been collected from just like a specific region or provenance, so we generally associate this with native or conservation type projects, but not in all cases. Next, we have selected in green. We're now starting to talk quality here. So selected seed would be collected from established and registered forest stands that show qualities such as superior form, vigor, health, etc. when compared against source identified in yellow here. So these stands, you would register a select stand with the Forestry Commission in the UK, and they would then inspect it. Next, the exciting bit, we move on to qualified and qualified in pink here and tested in blue. So we refer to these categories as improved as a result of selective tree breeding work. So the sort of starting point for any breeding program is the identification of what we call plus trees. So these are trees which are considered to be genetically superior and offer improvements in growth, form, etc. So material from these plus trees that were identified out on different farms, estates, forestry blocks, etc. The material from these trees is collected and then grafted onto a rootstock, and the trees are planted out to form a seed orchard. So tree breeding can take several decades to see a result, so it's we have to be very patient to try and see a result. The seed that is collected from these seed orchards in 25, 50 years time, perhaps less, would then be expected to show improvement in their characteristics. So that would be qualified or tested in blue if the progeny has been tested and the genetic gains are known. So it's the norm to use improved seed sources for coniferous and softwood species, as there are many different seed orchards available, and the UK started tree breeding work 50, 60 years ago. So we've been rewarded with the gains and benefits for many years. So a bit hurry up because I might go over my time limit. So good progress has been made with hardwood species, but in the UK we're a little bit further behind other European countries in terms of finished products. So most, perhaps all of the breeding work on broadleaves is carried out by a charity called the Future Trees Trust, and they're focusing on 7 species. We produce plants from seed that's been collected from their orchards. That's wild cherry, I think sycamore and silver birch. And we support that work. We think that's a good way forward. Okay, so we've looked at the type of tree, better or so. We've also looked at seed source, but we also must consider if the tree requires protection to ensure successful establishment. So we should consider what does the tree need protection from? What type of shelter do I need for the species that I'm planting? You know, not all tree species will benefit from tree shelters, or could fencing protect the trees if the area is larger, perhaps, or more square-like in shape. Perhaps then you might only require vole guards. So in our opinion, you know, tree shelters do provide an enhanced growing environment and protect not only against vermin, but also herbicide and exposure as well. So lots of considerations here. We're a major stockist tree guard, so happy to advise further or chat. So I'll put a little icon down the bottom here. Recently, the Forestry Commission, I guess it'll be in England now, have published a guide, a bit long-winded, by the title of Tree Protection, the Use of Tree Shelters and Guards, Guidance and Sustainability Best Practice. So in my opinion, this is quite a good, well-balanced guide, and it contains some useful flow charts to help with decision making. It's well worth the reading. It's probably in about 4 or 5 pages. Right, just finishing. So here's an unusual one for you. This is a product called a Leader Shield. It's a clip-on protector, and it helps to prevent against deer damage. So we quite like different sort of niche products, and we came across this German concept a few years ago. We experimented on our Boss's wood on conifers that had been planted 3 or 4 years previously, and they worked really well. So we now distribute them in the UK. So we've sold quite a few in the UK so far, and millions have been sold throughout Europe. Reusable. They just sort of clip onto the leader of the tree using your thumb, and they're moved up every year as part of a maintenance program. It costs about sort of 20 pence each. This is a biojute mulch mat, which provides weed protection. It's 100% biodegradable. Eliminates the need for herbicide as well. So we have this made to our spec, and it's very, very popular. We sell a lot of these every year. We supply it as a mat format for individual trees, but also in rolls for hedgerow planting as well. Okay, so hopefully you found this useful. One aspect that I probably should have mentioned on lots and lots of different occasions throughout is timing and forward planning. So yes, we do 80 to 100 different species from many different seed sources, but in order to get the right stock that you want and desire from the right species, you must forward plan. That's essential. So, you know, trees don't grow on trees, and speaking to your nursery well in advance is very important, especially as we're in a period of really high demand. So about 70% of the trees, I think, that we're producing for the forthcoming season are already sold, and then you look to the season after that, and about 50% are sold. You know, that's 14 months time away. So yeah, plan, and speak to your nurseries well in advance would be my summary.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jonathan. That's fantastic. You've given me a new appreciation for everything that's involved, from the duration of the breeding right through to the protection. It's much appreciated. If anyone has any questions, please type them in. We have some so far. So our first question takes us back to the cells. So do roots grow out from the cell after planting, or does cell root have to be spread at planting?
No, there's no requirement to manipulate the roots when you receive them. The plant is already very well trained by having these ridges in there, and you might just still be able to see on the last slide here, all the plants are raised above the ground as well. So when the roots reach the bottom of the growing trays, they are what we refer to as air pruned. So it's good to go. There's no further work required.
Perfect, thank you. And do you anticipate in any imminent tree diseases or likely future diseases?
Probably. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of really kind of nasty diseases out there that could, you know, devastate a lot of UK native and commercially important tree species. Yeah, I mean Xylella, which is a disease which is sort of making its way across from the continent, could have big implications, and we're just doing the best we can to sort of keep our nursery clean, and encouraging the rest of the industry to do the right thing and take the right measures, and reduce imports as well, which is the typical pathway for a lot of plant diseases coming in.
It's a scary thought, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
With reference to timing, when is the best time to plant out different species?
Yeah, there's lots of different sort of thoughts and opinions on this. I mean, we start dispatching in bulk from usually kind of mid-September onwards. We find that's quite a good kind of time because the soil's still quite warm, so the plant should put down a little bit of root prior to the winter, and that's generally quite helpful because when they start getting into the following spring, having a little bit of root is helpful, and especially given some of the dry springs that we've had. So I wouldn't say there's a good or a bad time. Obviously, you want to avoid the very, very warm summer months. But yeah, clients have different preferences really, and to suit different programs. So we have some clients that might use cells at the very start of the season to try and extend their window if they're doing big commercial programs, and then move on to bare roots in the traditional planting season, and then fall back on cells again in the spring. So you can get a good nearly 9 months of planting opportunity with cells.
Okay, great. And we have another question, another pessimistic question. What's the mortality rate for the saplings?
Yeah, that will vary quite a bit. I mean, we would like to see up to at least sort of 95%. I mean, in most cases, our clients won't go back and beat up following planting because there just isn't the need to do that. But yeah, it's very much site dependent and depending on where you are as well and soil factors. But yeah, we'd expect a very high success rate.
Great, good to hear.
Yeah.
Well, that's a nice note to end it on. Thank you very much, Jonathan. You deserve a well-earned break.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. For our next speaker, we will be hearing from Rob Robertson. So Rob Robertson is a co-owner and managing director of Robertson Fencing. So Robertson Fencing was formed in 2007 with an alternative approach to contract fencing in the agri-forestry sector. From their base in Highland, Perthshire, they have strengths in professionalism, reliability, quality, work and workmanship. Woodland creation is one of their main areas of interest. They're working closely with landowners and forestry companies to help meet their planting objectives and Scotland's exciting and ambitious afforestation targets. So thank you, Rab. I'll hand over to you now.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Poppy, and thanks for the opportunity to work for you guys today. So yeah, my name's Rob Robertson and I run a company called Robertson Fencing. We're involved in woodland creation works. I'll tell you a little bit about our business to start with. We were formed back in 2007, mainly serving the agricultural industry, stock fencing for farmers, etc. We quickly diversified into forestry fencing and deer fencing to meet the growing demand for these services based on the old SRDP forestry scheme. In 2010, we made a move to diversify into forestry ground preparation. It was just a good bolt-on service so that we could deliver two services to our clients for fencing and ground prep for new woodland creation. We've since then also moved into further forestry works, such as infrastructure, meaning that we can provide a total package for a woodland creation scheme, installing access, cultivating the land and preparing it for tree planting, and also carrying out the fencing works. In addition to our contracting services, we also supply fencing materials for customers all over Scotland, including 40-year service life creosoted timber. The combination of our services has, defined us as woodland creation specialists, and that's certainly our main focus of interest in our business for the next 5 to 10 years. And we're based in Pitlochry, Highland, Perthshire, which is a great central location in Scotland and in an area where a lot of forestry is happening at the moment. So it's a good logistical position. First of all, I'd like to talk to you about forestry ground preparation and the kind of work that we do in that sector that's relevant. So the first thing we need to consider is why do we actually prepare the ground to start with. So our role as ground preparation contractors is to provide consistent planting positions. When planting teams come in, we're able to provide them with good locations to plant their trees. Another huge part of the job we do is to provide a planting density for the planters. So no matter what type of woodland you're going to be installing, whether it's native or whether it's commercial, you will have a requirement to meet a certain stocking density, and that is something that the ground prep initially controls. The other benefits of ground prep are it's going to improve the soil structure. It can reduce compaction in ground that's not been cultivated for a long time, which is going to help the rooting development of your trees as you grow them as a crop. As we cultivate the land for ground preparation, the soils are also going to be aerated. It's going to make them more suitable for the tree crop to establish. A huge part of the job we do is vegetation control. So as we cultivate the land, we're going to suppress weeds, give a clean area for the planters to plant their tree in, where hopefully the weeds do not re-establish and choke out trees as they're growing. Another added benefit to the ground preparation process is it can improve the drainage on the sites, which is sometimes critical to improve the quality of the land. So I've broken the types of ground preparation down into a few categories. The first category is trailed ground prep, and that's where we're pulling big draft implements through the ground with a tractor or a crawler unit, very similar to agricultural practices. The available techniques out there at the moment are ploughing, scarifying, continual mounding, and ripping or subsoiling. So these are carried out behind tractors or crawler units, and they're well suited to larger areas where you can make good progress up and down either the field or the hill land, and it's a really efficient way to carry out ground prep, and it's at the cheaper end of the scale because it's quicker and more simple. The second more common ground prep technique is an excavator-based system where diggers and excavators are used to create mounds for tree planting. I'm sure you've all heard the term mounding. So there's various techniques used. Hinge mounding, where the soil is flipped over in a hinging effect to create a hole, but also a mound where the tree can be planted on top of. Invert mounding, the process is similar, where the soil is lifted up and then dropped upside down back into the same hole that it came from. And then ditch mounding or ditch dolloping, that's a process in which we actually form a ditch or a drain, and the spoil from this ditch and the drain is used to create planting positions on either side. Another consideration that must be made for preparing the ground for tree planting and afforestation is controlling the vegetation that's already there. Some land that's suitable for forestry could at the moment be covered by bracken, heather, gorse. So sometimes we're employed to clear these vegetative species as well to allow us to carry out further ground prep to establish the trees. Another option that has to be considered, although not popular and very expensive, is a manual option called screefing, where the tree planters will actually clear the ground and prepare it for tree planting with spades or mattocks, but it's obviously very labour intensive, very expensive, and prone to inconsistencies. So it's one there that should be considered, but not greatly popular. So the rest of these slides in the ground prep section are pretty photo driven, so I'll talk you through them as we go. So this is double moldboard forestry ploughing. It's quite a well-established technique that's just come back into favour in the last few years due to the popularity of establishing commercial conifer plantations. It was popularised back in the 60s, 70s and 80s when the Forestry Commission planted large areas in Scotland. So a plough has been pulled here with a fairly standard agricultural tractor with some double wheels, and it's thrown a furrow out either side. And you can also see in the middle there's a ripping tine on the bottom of the plough that's penetrating below the plough furrow, which is breaking up the pan and going to help the drainage and the root structure. So the trees will be planted on the top of these furrows to either side. And this has obviously made a lot of black ground there. There's a lot of vegetation control. And there's also drainage elements in that too. So the water is going to move down the plough furrows. This is another example of some double moldboard ploughing. It also shows where the ripper tine on the bottom of the plough is penetrated below the peat. and it's broken up the pan underneath. Also shows you the changes in direction of the ploughing operation, which is good water management, so we're not getting a lot of runoff on the plough furrows. This is single furrow forestry ploughing. We're actually pulling 2 units with one operation here to form plough furrows. Again, the trees will be planted on top of the furrows. One of the benefits of this system that our customers have asked us for is in regard to future thinning of the crops. So this doesn't have the big central trench that the double throw plough creates. So single rows of trees can be thinned out much more simply with mechanical harvesters and forwarders in the future. So this is an interesting technique if you're thinking about thinning out in the future. This is one of the more current technologies in forestry ground prep. This is called continual mounding, and it's a trailed system again, as you can see. These machines have 2 rows of 3 spades on either side, and they're controlled by a land wheel where the spades are dragged along through the ground, collecting the soil. Then they're tripped and they flip the turf over, creating a mound, and then the process starts again in a continual manner, and you drive along creating rows, as you can see in the background of that photo. That's a commercial spacing, so that's 2 meters by 2 meters or 1.9 by 1.9, so that's going to give a density of about 2,500 or 2,700 trees per hectare. This is another picture of continual mounding. It's becoming more popular now because it's much better for a few things really. It doesn't release as much carbon as ploughing because it's not opening up so much ground. There's also less risk of erosion, and there's a bit less visual impact with it. So continual mounding is becoming more and more popular. This shows some scarification. It looks quite similar to ploughing. It's a linear trailed ground prep technique. On the back of the tractor there, you can see the scarifier has 2 hydraulically powered discs, which are powered as the tractor moves along, and the teeth on the discs are throwing away the turf and clearing space on the ground below. It's very good at stripping away vegetation to clear the space for tree planting. And it's also very well suited to very shallow soils that can't be penetrated by, for example, ploughing or continual mounding. This is us moving into excavator-based systems. And this is a bit of redundant, low-quality agricultural land that we did a few years ago. And this shows hinge mounding in a commercial spacing, again, 2 meters, 1.9 meter spacing. And the mounds have been pulled there and flipped over to create a mound for the trees to be planted on. And again, you can see how when the planters go in here, the density is defined by us carrying out the ground preparation. They just have to basically put a tree in each mound, and the responsibility for creating the density is on us, not them. This is more hinge mounding in an upland situation, maybe on some hill ground. Again, the mounds have been pulled downhill. So hinge mounding can be unpopular sometimes, as it does leave a hole in the ground beside the mound, and it stereotypically fills with water, veges over, and then when you're walking through these sites, it can be quite dangerous. So that's hinge mounding shown there, and it's also a good illustration of the varying soil types that we work with there, from the peaty soils in the bottom back up to the more mineral soils in the bank. This is another excavator-based system. This is invert mounding that we talked about earlier on, and this is where the soil was lifted up and dropped back into the same hole from where it came from. It provides a more subtle approach to hinge mounding. There's not the associated hole that is created with hinge mounding, and it's very popular where amenity use is prevalent in the woodland and where people want to walk through it quite a lot. There's not these hazards to be dealt with. And this is the other technique we talked about, ditch or drain mounding. So here we pull the V-ditch, which is providing drainage for the site. The water's properly managed, and the spoil from the drain is cast out on either side, again creating a density for tree planting. And it's really 2 services in one. You're able to drain your land and you're creating planted positions as you go. This is just some pictures of the de-vegging work we do. Again, lots of competition on this site by weeds and grasses. So in advance of carrying out ground prep, we can do flailing and mulching to try and cope with some of this vegetation pre-planting. Again, this is another site that we carried out for SAC down in Fife. Heavy crop of gorse on here. No way we could cultivate that or plant trees. So We've used a fairly robust chain swipe on the back of the tractor to mulch that down. It's going to clear the land, destroy the vegetation, and that allows us to carry out ground preparation for planting positions. There's another picture on the same site, just another technique that we use. It's a mulcher head on an excavator on steeper land where the tractors can't drive. So again, getting rid of all the vegetation so that we can plant trees. So potential problems that we have to deal with ground preparation, water management is our big issue that we have to deal with. Ploughing, drainage, all these kind of things can cause silt and runoff, and we are governed by the forest water guidelines that are very strict in terms of what we can and what we cannot do. We can only drain up to a maximum of, I think, 3 degrees, and anything above that, we have to stop any drains or any runoff or any plough furrows at a maximum of 30-metre intervals. So water management is critical, and it's one thing that really, can get both us as contractors and our clients in trouble if we pollute rivers and waterways. So that's something that has to be managed from the off when we make our plan when we start a project. Visual impact should also be considered. There's a varying level of impact from different ground prep techniques. Ploughing is obviously very visually obvious. So people sometimes, if they've got a site that's important, they maybe don't want to carry out ploughing, and maybe mounding is more appropriate or something a bit less visual. So that has to be taken into consideration when you're planning your schemes as well. Again, we've touched on the amenity use. Often woodlands are not just purely for forestry, they're used for other things, recreation, sporting use, shelter. So you need to consider what these woodlands are going to be used for and what type of ground preparation is appropriate for that. And I think George touched on it at the start of the webinar today. Carbon is becoming a very big issue. Carbon is a driving force why we're trying to do this woodland creation process. So we also have to be responsible in the amount of carbon that we release when we're actually preparing the ground. So there are, I know, for example, FLS, which is Forestry Commission in Old Money, they're moving all the time away from aggressive ground preparation techniques to much more light touch to try and alleviate the carbon release associated with forestry ground prep. So moving on to fencing, the second part of my presentation. Again, while we're looking at fencing off these forestry areas, we have to protect our trees, and this is mainly against herbivores who are going to browse and eat the trees. It's such a big investment to plan and carry out a new woodland. Protection is really critical to the success or failure of the project. I think that'll be agreed by everyone. So as agricultural audience today, we need to keep livestock out of these woodlands. We also need to keep the deer out of these areas that we're going to fence off. And then we've also got to consider the smaller animals like hares and rabbits that can be very destructive to timber crop. The types of fencing that we would erect for forestry purposes are, first off, stock fencing. Now that is going to work for agricultural livestock, sheep and cattle. But again, the trees may require further protection from deer or from voles or things like that. So tubes and guards could be appropriate to be used in addition with a stock fence. If we have a lot of deer pressure, deer fencing is probably the way that we have to go, and that is going to serve a lot of purposes. It's going to be suitable for livestock, and it's going to be suitable for deer. There's such a huge specification available for fencing, and it's really important to try and match the requirements of the woodland creation scheme with the specification that's possible. There's a big difference between a woodland creation scheme at high altitude, an upland forestry site, and then an agricultural unit on lower ground. The species of deer, etc., may be different. The stock pressure could be different. So you really have to balance your specification with the situation you have. Most people will be aware, if they've been involved in anything to do with fencing or agriculture in the last few years, that timber quality and rot outs have been a massive problem. We've had in the industry terrible early rot occurrences where fences that we've installed have rotted out within 6 years. And it's basically down to poor timber treatment. The treatment is copper-based treatment that we mainly have in the UK at the moment. And if the timber is not prepared in the right way, we don't get enough chemical uptake on this, and the timber is not lasting. So it's critical that we have well-prepared timber, which is dried mainly in a kiln and then treated to the right standard. The two quality, there's some unwarranted timber out there, some cheap timber that is available in the market, but it really shouldn't be used for woodland creation because it's probably going to let you down in the short term. The two recommendations we would give is 15-year warranty timber, that's kiln-dried, copper-based treatment. There's many sawmills in Scotland now offering a 15-year warranty, which is really helpful. And then there is also the more expensive but very long-term minded 40-year service life exhausted timber, not always suitable for environmental reasons, but it does give you a long-term investment. So this is, again, some slides, just some picture-driven stuff to take you through. This is an agricultural stock fence that we're using. It's actually an AIC scheme, not a forestry scheme, but again, same kind of thing. This will control your livestock to keep them out of forest areas. This is exhausted timber and tornado net, so that's a standard stock fence that could be used in a forestry situation. The next slide shows a more upland woodland creation scheme. So here you have some 15-year warranty Scots pine posts, 5 metre spacing, and a tornado deer net. As you can see, it's in an upland environment, so this is going to take a lot of snow, and critically, it's also going to have a high red deer pressure. So this is a good, robust fence for a woodland creation and in an upland environment. This is another woodland creation fence that we installed quite recently, and it's showing the benefits of installing rabbit net on the bottom of fences. These were young hares that were trying to get back into the land that had just been planted, and it does show the benefits of actually having rabbit and hare put on your fence. It does do a good job, especially if there's a high population of these animals in the area. More examples of deer fence, and again, high spec fence here. The wooden droppers on the fence are for environmental reasons, mainly marked fences for black grouse protection. So deer fencing does kill black grouse, capercaillie. They do fly into fences from time to time. So if you do have those kind of species in your area, you're probably going to be asked to provide protection on the fences. So we mark fences in various ways, and here we're using softwood battens clipped to the fence to make it a bit more visible so that birds don't fly into it. Again, that's a good high spec fence, good 100mm posts with a full height deer net and also rabbit and hare protection on the bottom. So that's a good illustration of a woodland creation fence. This is a lighter specification of deer fence. As I say, specifications go on and on. You've just really got to pick them to suit your situation. This is a low deer pressure fence that's going to be only required for 5 to 10 years to allow a commercial crop to establish. So it's light posts, light high tensile netting, and that fence will serve its purpose to establish a tree crop in the short term. This picture shows a good woodland creation scenario where we have, again, fence marks with bamboo canes for bird strike, good rabbit and hare protection on the bottom of the fence, and also a nice tree growing in the foreground on a hinge mound. So when it comes to planning your projects, you need to choose the correct specification. Questions to ask are, is there going to be livestock pressure on this fence? So are your sheep and cattle going to be up against it, browsing and rubbing on it all the time? If so, do we need to install additional posts? Do we need to make the specification higher, maybe an offset fence to keep them off it? Is there going to be deer pressure in your area? Are the red deer, or the fallow, or the roe? Depending on what type of deer pressure there is, we may choose a different specification for low roe deer pressure. It's obviously going to be less than red deer pressure out in the mountains. Again, is there going to be hares and rabbits? Do we need to invest in putting rabbit net on the bottom of this fence to keep your trees safe? Another interesting thing to think about is this fence going to serve another purpose? Is it purely for woodland creation? Does it form a boundary with your neighbour? Maybe you want to think about longer term options. If it is that, also, is it going to form another use on your farm? For example, deer farm conversion works, things like this. So it's best to pick the specification that suits the scenario. Potential problems we find as contractors, especially in the woodland creation game, is impractical fence lines. People sometimes want us to fence areas that are really not suitable for fencing. The best fences that contractors will deliver for you will basically be in the straightest lines on the most level ground. As soon as you move away from that, the fencing becomes more impractical. So sometimes we're asked to fence off some really difficult areas, and we know that the fences won't really be that good a quality on them. So planning fence lines, putting the fences in good areas where the fence has a chance is a good thing to look at from the outset, and that's where your contractor can really help you to advise you where you can build a good fence. And again, as woodland creation kicks off and we start doing more and more things up in the uplands, we're looking at challenging ground conditions, rock, deep peat, and we have to adapt our practices to deal with that, from more reinforcing in the ground where it's deep peat into using metal posts and rock drilling on the sheet rock on the higher ground. So these are the kind of problems that we encounter. As well as that, material layout can be a big issue, especially on higher ground. So sometimes we're using helicopters, etc., things like that to lay out fencing material. So that's a brief summary and the problems we encounter. So hopefully that's been useful and it's been of some interest.
Thank you very much, Rab. Sorry, I was about to just cut in just to check you're okay for time, and you're doing well. So thank you very much. And good to hear about, the joined up thinking, I guess, from the ground preparation perspective, to make sure that you're not adding to the CO2 or the water pollution problem through the cultivations. So thank you for that, and such a comprehensive guide, I guess, to the different options you've got and fencing you've got. If anyone has any questions, we do have just a couple of minutes and then we'll move on. And I have a couple through here. So on well-drained brown earths, what would be the best way to establish a weed-free site? So this person has had problems with continuous mounding and with encouraging weed germination. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, I think in really fertile brown earth sites, weeds are always going to be a problem. So ground prep alone may not be enough. So I think as a joined up thinking, again, you want to balance your ground prep with possible herbicides as well. So if you have got fertile soils, your trees are going to grow well. So they're going to come quickly, but the first couple of years you're going to need to manage the vegetation as well. So it may not simply be a ground prep issue. There may be it may need to be a backup on herbicide as well.
Okay, thank you. In the dry weather that we've recently, that we had in April and May, is there a better technique for establishing woodlands in drought?
There are. I mean, things like invert mounding will hold a bit more moisture in the ground because we've not actually got the mounds or the plough furrows sitting up in the air. Okay. And it seems to be a pattern that we are in now in Scotland. We seem to get very dry springs. So the last 2 or 3 planting seasons have been very dry. So I think, again, ground prep, you can give it consideration, but I think as well, sensible project planning and knowing when to plant and when not to plant is that responsible planting timing is probably more important, especially when we look at things like cell-grown trees. We can plant them later in the season. So if we do get a very dry April and May, it's maybe better hanging off, not planting very dry ground before the rain comes back.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, Rab. That was fantastic. We will now move on to our final speaker of the evening, Julie Paton of Scottish Forestry. Julie is responsible for forestry policy, support and regulation. She is a woodland officer working with land managers in central Scotland to deliver all aspects of the forestry grant scheme from pre-application to claim. So a very useful speaker for our final speaker of the evening. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you very much for the introduction. The previous speakers have set me up perfectly for this, and I'll try and be quick because I know you'll all be wanting to go and get your tea. Okay, so I've been asked to cover what makes a new woodland planting project successful from Scottish Forestry's perspective. If you're not familiar with Scottish Forestry, we replaced Forestry Commission Scotland in April of last year, but still performing most of the same functions. So how do you make the best start to your new planting project? You might have heard the phrase right tree, right place. I would add for the right reason. As a farm business, you need to think about what are these trees going to do for you, what are your long-term business commitments, what's your long-term timber demand. In the short term, where could trees add value to what you're doing now? Your measure of its success will be how well it integrates and how much benefit you gain for it. So think about that when you're choosing the ground that you want to give over for new woodland creation. Once you've decided where you want to plant, It's a case of doing your homework and gathering as much information on the site as you can, and evaluating the impacts that new planting will have on different factors and the impact of different factors on your site. So you need to look into things like how's it going to affect the local population, for example. Do you have private water supplies that are going to be impacted by it? Do you have protected habitats or species on the land? What's your soil like? Do you have any deep peat? We have we will exclude deep peat over 50 centimetres. Do you have water courses running through the site? How are you going to buffer them? How are you going to protect drinking water catchments? Do you have infrastructure? Do you have utilities on the site? Do you have rights of way? What's the landscape value? Are there designations on the site? Do you have archaeology? As you can see, the list goes on. The more information that you can take, that you can gather, be it through web-based desk studies or practical surveys, habitat surveys, site assessments, archaeological surveys. The more you know about the site, the better informed you're going to be, and the more likely you are to choose the right species and the right design for your site. Forestry Commission produced a woodland creation application guidance document, which is available online. It's a step-by-step guide, and we'll talk you through all of the parts of the grant process, should you decide to do that. I'm not going to say too much about the Forestry Grant Scheme here. Suffice to say that it's there, it's part of the SRDP, it's a competitive scheme, it's online. We take applications in all year round, and we are processing and approving applications all year round. The grant will support your ground prep, your initial planting, purchase of the plants. It will fund tree protection, fencing, tubes, vole guards, etc. You also get 5 years annual maintenance through the annual recurrent payments to ensure that you're doing your beat up, your weeding, your maintenance, to make sure that at year 5 you have the stocking densities that the auction requires of you, and you'll still retain your BPS entitlement on a forested land. All the information is at ruralpayments.org, and happy to send on more details as required. Okay, so once you've decided to go ahead, you'd be well advised to appoint an agent to do the application for you. You need to produce contract maps and an operational plan that clearly outline what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. So what are you planting? How are you going to plant it? How are you doing your ground prep? What's your maintenance regime? And that will be really important, especially if you're going to do any of the work yourself. You might want an agent to do the plan for you, but you might want to do some of it yourself, in which case you need to know exactly what's going where, when and how, because the contract that you sign off is binding, and you've signed up to those terms and specifications and conditions. So make sure it's understandable. In the short term, you'll also want to phase the work around your other farm business activities and your own cash flow. Grant is always claimed retrospectively, so think about that when you're submitting plans. In the longer term, this is much longer term, question was asked earlier on about tree pests and diseases. Fact of the matter is, we don't know what's coming next. We've seen what Phytophthora ramorum was doing on larch, moving up from southwest Scotland up to the west coast. We've seen the effects of ash dieback, and the loss of ash is a component of our woodlands. So we don't know what's coming next. Nobody's got a crystal ball, and we're looking at a 40, 50, 60, 70 year, 100-year crop. So species diversity should help improve the resilience of your woodland, and it's not just tree pests and diseases that you're going to have to think about. We're in a changing climate. How's your wood going to respond to that? How is this wood going to help the rest of your farm respond to a changing climate? So keeping one eye on cash flow today and another eye a few years down the line will put you in good stead. Once you've got your contract signed up and you're good to go, make sure that you're working with agents and contractors that you can work with, and as I've said, make sure everybody is well briefed. A plan is only going to be as good as the understanding of the folk that you give it to. Make sure that you're using materials, be they gates, tree shelters, what have you, as per the plan and the specifications of your contract. As Jonathan said, order your plants in plenty of time. retain the paperwork, hold on to the seed certificates, plan ahead, plan. When you start work, good supervision will be key. If you're working with the agent, if you're separating out tasks, who's responsible for what and when, agree the timetables. Scottish Forestry can't recommend an agent. We can't tell you how to set up the working agreement between the two parties, but you need to know when something's going to be done and when somebody's going to turn up to do it. Every operation is going to need supervision, from the fencing right through to beating up and formative pruning if that needs to be done a few years down the line. Flag up your problems early, be that with the contractor or the agent or with Scottish Forestry. We can accommodate some changes. Even with the best site assessment in the world, things come up. Maybe you can't get the trees you were looking for. You need to change species. We can make variations, but we need to know early. If we're presented with a claim for a scheme that's been delivered completely different to the way the application came in, you may have some problems, and there could be an implication there for finance, for your finance to have to fix it. Once everything's in the ground, it's not a case of closing the gate, walking away for 20 years. You can't just leave a new woodland to get on with it. You need to keep monitoring. We heard in the last presentation about deer pressure. Something's going to try and eat those trees, so you need to keep an eye on them, and keep an eye on your fences too in the early years to make sure that your time hasn't been wasted in planting. So how do you know when you've got it right? Well, you'll submit a claim to Scottish Forestry, and they'll be checked against your contract. We'll check them against the option guidance. So we'll be making sure that the stocking density required of the option is there. We'll also check it against the UK Forest Standard and other cross-compliance regulations. Scottish Forestry staff carry out admin checks and on-site inspections. That's why you should hold on to your seed certificates, so we know if you've planted a native scheme, we know that you've used the correct provenance. Our inspections are usually unannounced and always unaccompanied, and non-compliance with your contract can result in breaches with financial penalties. So it goes back to the supervision. If you think there's a problem, stop, check it out, and then move on. It's a lot more expensive to fix something once it's gone wrong. I'm aware that time is racing on, so I will just go through some images here of things that we're looking out for and things that you need to look out for. First up, when you're planning, consider access for yourself and access for other people. You have an open ground allowance within most of the options, so how can you use that to make sure that you can still get to and from the places around your farm that you might need to? You'll also need to keep the scheme open to the public. We don't want to see any locked gates, and the Scottish Outdoor Access Code will still apply for responsible access. It's not just humans that will try and get into your scheme. I'm not saying that badgers know where all the gates are, but if you've got them bashing through your fences, it's opening them up and they're becoming porous. More herbivores are going to come in and you're creating more problems. Likewise, I find it's maybe hard to fence. This slide here, it's a water course that went into spate, so the fence has collapsed, and somebody's going to have to go back in there and repair that. So it's all cost that you can avoid with some good planning. But also, again, keep an eye on your fences, make sure that they are entire and doing the job that they need to do. Challenges inside the fence. You can see here, that's a fairly well established deer run. Here you've got a fence over a rabbit warren. Don't fence in your herbivores. Herbivore control is essential because new schemes are like a salad bar for herbivores, and it's not going to, you're going to be fighting against them. We've heard about vegetation control already, so I won't say too much about that. But remember, if it, like wet ground, you've got an open ground allowance within the options. It's not going to be wall to wall, so use your open ground sensibly to avoid the challenging ground that you'd have to deal with. Considerate ground preparation is key. It has to be suited to soil type and the site topography. Mounding will give the site order, but basically wherever a mound goes, a plant will go. And if somebody isn't supervising the mounding, you're going to get plants in the wrong place. Here we've got conifers planted adjacent to a watercourse. They should be further back. That could potentially be a breach of the Forest and Water guidelines. So yeah, supervision, keep on top of it. Using quality plants well planted. Don't store them in cheap free cotton bags. Your planters scheme sometimes is only as good as the planting. Here, this red circle is the one tree that the inspector found. I think 1 in 5 mounds have been planted. Here you've got a tree in front of a rabbit burrow. If the plants aren't planted, they're not going to grow, and you're not going to get your stock and density. So again, supervision, and make sure that work is being well monitored. This image here is a seed certificate, which goes back to the plant passports and provenance that we need proof of and talked about earlier on in the evening. Drainage, very quickly. Ponding, if you've got ponding, it's just if a site isn't well drained, your roots are going to get waterlogged, your trees won't thrive. Drains that turn into watercourses presents another problem. This one's eroding and becoming a problem in the making. So yes, that also needs to be considered and appropriately done. Tree protection, vegetation control. Previous speakers have touched on this too. One of the challenges I would say coming forward more and more is improved and semi-improved grounds coming forward for planting. There's a heavy weed burden in there. We've struggled to find the trees are struggling against all that vegetation. Bracken, again, think about if you remove the bracken before planting, how are you going to treat it as the trees are growing up? Because the bracken will just fall over and smash trees. If you don't, chemical spraying is fine, but make sure that you're spraying the weeds and not the trees themselves. Again, good supervision will stop that. You're going to get losses, some through herbivores. So again, herbivore control is essential. Some losses might be the way plants have been handled. It might be with the best will in the world, the wrong species, something that maybe it's a microclimate and that tree's just not going to sit there. If trees are planted too late into a dry spring, they're going to desiccate and dry out. As I say, we can accommodate changes in species, but we need to know, but you do need to keep on top of your losses so that you're maintaining the stocking density at year 5. Finally, I would say, yeah, walk around, don't walk away. Once you've got your trees up and away after year 5, you still need to keep an eye on them. Empty trees don't grow woodlands, and here, deer pressure is still a problem. The browsing there, you're not going to get the good form that you were looking for, and it's long-term damage. Conversely, you might want to be pruning your trees. If you're growing broadleaves, for example, the timber value is in a long clean stem, so formative pruning, maybe around year 7 to 10, you'll need to think about that. But yes, you can't just put the trees in the ground and then walk away. Keep an eye on them, and you're keeping an eye on your investment at the same time. There's lots of information online. If you're thinking about planting, I would suggest getting in touch early doors with your local Scottish Forestry Conservancy. Woodland officers will be able to help you with a very kind of high-level constraints check and flag up any issues early doors. There's also lots of information on the FAS website, so well worth a look. And that's it.
Thank you, Julie. That's fantastic. And I think the key words from yours, planning and supervision. It's not
Yes.
an easy approach, but well, it's not. I would just like to take this opportunity just to thank all of our speakers. You've given us all a quite comprehensive guide to everything that needs to be considered when it comes to planting forestries. So very much a lot of detail, and I really hope that our audience have taken bits and pieces away from that are useful to their own planting projects. I actually, as we're at 7:30 and we haven't had too many questions through it, I might just leave it there for yourself, Julie. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to all our speakers. And just for our last slide, just like to remind our audience, one moment, of our final in the series, which is going to be held next Thursday evening. So we've come from the benefits to the establishment, and then finally a bit more on managing existing farm woodlands. There is a whole host, the speakers have referred to a whole host of information. For further information, there is a section on the Farm Advisory Service Scotland website. And just finally, please, if you get the email reminder through, please do complete the survey. Like I say, that is quite important to us to understand whether this funding is used in a way that's useful to yourselves. I would like to just thank you all for joining us and participating in this webinar this evening. And I will bring this webinar to a close now. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much.